Magandang umaga, magandang tanghali, magandang gabi, magandang hating gabi kung anong oras nyo man to pinapanood, guys. So ito ang aming roundtable discussion for Jog 1. Pag-uusapan natin today ang Ukraine-Russia War gamit ang mga concepts na nakuha natin sa economic geography. So kilalanin muna natin yung mga speakers. So ang mga nagagandahan at nagwagwapuhang speakers. So ito sila, kasama nyo kami. Si Ken, si Carlito, si Chris, and yours truly, si Jesus. At bago natin pag-usapan yung Ukraine-Russia War, gusto muna namin kayong bigyan ng overview sa timeline kung ano nga ba yung nangyari sa Ukraine-Russia War. Kasi sure naman na iilan lang ang nakakaalam kung ano nga ba talaga ang nangyari sa Ukraine-Russia War. Hindi lang yan simpleng putukan, barilan, and mga nagkaroon ng mga casualties. So, next slide please. Ayan. So, nag-provide kami dito ng 8 buwan kung saan makikita natin yung dahan-dahang pagbabago between Ukraine and Russia during the war. So, una nung February, this year, 2022 yan nangyari. So, yung Russia, inatake niya yung capital ng Ukraine, na Kyiv. Sana tama ang aking pronunciation. Please forgive me kung mali. Yan, inatake yung Kyiv. And also, tumagal yan ng ilang linggo din sa buong February. And hindi kinaya ng Russia ang Ukrainian resistance dahil sabihin natin medyo biglaan yung paglabas ng news ng Ukraine-Russia war, but somehow yung Ukraine is matagal nang predicted na pwedeng gawin ito ng Russia anytime yung ganitong move. And by March, nag-try ulit yung Russia na pasukin ang lugar ng Ukraine. Ngayon naman, sa south sila pumasok. Kinuha nila ang probinsya ng Kherson. Sana tama ang pronunciation ko. And nung April, so dito na medyo nag-boom sa social media ang Ukraine-Russia war. Biglang sumikat yung mga pictures ng isang missile strike sa isang train station sa Kramatorsk. Sana tama ang aking pronunciation ulit dyan. So, ayun, kung lang tatandaan nyo, around April, lumabas ang mga pictures kung saan maraming mga nasirang bahay, may mga posts, kung saan feeling nila yung kanilang safety is pwedeng anytime soon is mapahamak sila dahil nag-umpisa na nagkaroon ng malaking movement dahil isa yan Russian missile strike. So, medyo malaki yung possible na casualty para sa Ukraine. And also nung May, nag-start naman ang Russia na sugurin ang naval forces ng Ukraine. So ang Mariupol, isang port city sa Ukraine, ay nagsuffer ng mga maraming pagsabog upang lumikas yung mga Ukrainian forces na nakatalaga sa Mariupol, yung port city. And nung pagdating ng June, next slide po, yan. So pagdating ng June, tumindi lalo yung naval tension. So yung Snake Island na matatagpuan din sa Ukraine is nakuha ng Russia. And by July, ang huling city na naka-fall under Ukrainian power is nag-fall ang Luhansk. Ayan. So nag-fall sila sa Russia. And by August, dito nag-start na magkaroon ng countermeasures ng mga lumalaban na ang Ukraine kontra Russia, nagkaroon ng counter-offense. Sa tulong ito ng US at mga other Western countries, so makikita natin dito na nagkaroon ng exportation and importation ng mga nuclear machineries. And also pagdating ng September, ang Ukraine ay dahan-dahang nakuha ulit ang mga ilang parte ng kanilang region. Isa dito ay ang Northeastern Kharkiv region. At para naman sa thesis ng aming report at para sa out-align, nandyan si Carlito. Go, Carlito. Take it away.
Thank you, Jesus. I just want to add sa mga sinasabi mo because I want to join in the conversation. 10 months na pala nag-start ng war, and geographically speaking, makatabi lang yung Russia and Ukraine, right? So hopefully, because because they're so close, hopefully go to safety naman yung mga citizens ng Ukraine. So thank you, Jesus, for the overview of the significant events that happened this year. With that context laid out, the goal for this roundtable discussion is to develop better understanding on the geographical and economical implications and effects of this ongoing war between Ukraine and Russia. So with that in mind, the discussion outline is as follows. Following the end of this intro is part 1, which is the history of Ukraine and Russia before the war. So this is taken in a geographical and economical viewpoint. And part 2 will be the drastic changes both countries underwent ever since the war started. And then part 3 will be important because this ties in with our lessons with Sir. It's an analysis of the effects of the war with a geographical point of view. And then part 4, the last of it all, will be our individual insights and reflections on this war. So So does any speaker here want to join in the discussion before I begin the history of Ukraine?
Ayan, so feeling ko sobrang malaman yung topic natin today at ma-apply natin yung mga economical, geographical concepts na nakuha natin sa Jog 1 dahil
Yes,
sa
I agree.
Ukraine-Russia war. Yep, agree. And feeling ko mas lalong maiintindihan pa ng audience kung ano nga bang ekonomiya bago nagkaroon ng war sa tulong natin. So pag-usapan muna natin ang Ukraine at yung Russia.
Yes.
Take
So
it away,
look
Carlito.
forward to part 1 and 3, guys. Thank you, Jesus. So part 1, history of Russia and Ukraine before the war. So let's start with Ukraine. As you can see, Ukraine is in between the European Union and Russia. So to start off, there are a lot of reasons behind Ukraine's conflict alongside a lot of geographical interests at stake. So geographically speaking, kasi guys, Ukraine is in a good spot. Look, it's in the middle of the Eurasian continent. So uh, because of this, this geographical wall surrounding it, it its location affected its future for the coming decades. So let's start with as early history as early as 1991, where Russia made the Warsaw Pact. So on the right side, Russia, they made a Warsaw Pact to keep peace between the other nations. On the left side naman, Europe created the NATO. And these are military defense treaties that protect countries by stationing military in defensive positions. However, since the fall of the Soviet Union, we learned that's a history class, right, guys? NATO and the European Union, yung left side, yung green, they started to expand towards east, towards Russia. And of course, Russia doesn't want that, right, guys? If you're Russia and your enemies start going near you, you wouldn't want that, right? So consequently, this also leaves only a few countries, including Ukraine, that haven't joined EU or NATO yet. So remember, guys, Ukraine is in a very key geographical location. So fast forward to 2008 and 2010, Ukraine's population was split literally in half because of the geographical conflicts. So one half wants to fulfill the application for NATO, and while the other half wants to strengthen ties with Russia. So kalahating kalahati. They want to join Europe or they want to join Russia. So the country was so divided that when Viktor Yanukovych, the president of 2010, when he won, all of his votes came from the east side because his political campaign was to strengthen ties with Russia. So because of that, what happened to the eastern side who voted against Yanukovych? Well, they protested in 2013 and it was very violent. It was almost close to having a civil war. And this geographical division continued on and on for years. And at some point, regional parts east of Ukraine, so around here, such as Crimea, Donetsk, and Luhansk, yung countries na sinasabi ni Jesus a while ago, they mutually parted from Ukraine's borders and joined Russia instead. So geographically, Ukraine was really split. However, because they joined Russia, that backfired against the government and a civil war sparked. A civil war between unity of Ukraine and separatists to go with Russia. And in that civil war, many people died. So many people died that international governments like the USA and other European governments had to step in. Now going back to the present, why is this geographical division so important? Well, because Ukraine, in terms of trade unions, Ukraine would be a perfect addition to Europe because it will make it the biggest country in terms of GDP, economics. But Russia also wants Ukraine because they're also forming. So if left side has the European Union, the right side also has the Eurasian Economic Union, including countries like Belarus and Kazakhstan. So it's like they're both sides are fighting for Ukraine because they're good. Ukraine is such in a good geographical location. And one important thing to also note is that Ukraine can serve as the buffer zone from between NATO's nuclear weapons and Russia. So really, Ukraine is very important to Russia. So yeah, all in all, Ukraine is so important because of its geographical location. And because it's so torn between two sides, whatever side Ukraine chooses will affect the rest of the world, which we will find out more moving forward to discussion. So what do you think, guys, before we move on?
Ayan si Ken. May share daw si Ken. Okay.
Yes, Ken, what do you think? Would
Oh,
you want
before I
Ukraine to
start,
join Europe or Russia?
Kasi if I were the one to be asked about that question, I think parang mahirap kasi I'm a Filipino and yun parang mahirap ang stance. Pero as you discussed, Carl, it's really intriguing. Lalo na yung statement mo na location affects future. And actually, sneak peek lang, we will be discussing that further later sa part 3, yung geographical concepts. Pero going back, yung parang ano mo, thought to ponder. If I were Russia, for example, if gusto ko bang sumali yung Ukraine sa NATO, it's really something worth considering kasi it parang, as you said, Ukraine is a buffer zone for between NATO and the Warsaw or yung pact ng Russia. And it it's different or kaya it's scary knowing na your neighbor is your parang your enemy or your opponent is closer to you if sasali nga yung Ukraine sa NATO. And with
Exactly.
that said, Chris, di kita narinig. Do you have any thoughts to add?
Ayan, go Chris. Okay.
Yes, Chris. Do you think Ukraine should join Russian Eurasian Economic Union or the European Union and NATO, given its geographical advantage?
Ayan, go Chris. Ayan, so it's yours. Ayan, ayan. Go Chris, go. Nakamute ka pa, Chris. Yeah. Okay lang yan. Online class kasi. Okay lang.
Go, Chris. Naka-mute ka,
Nakamute ka.
Beb.
Nakamute ka. Yan.
Sorry,
Yan.
sorry.
Yeah.
There
Ayan.
we go.
Okay lang.
Medyo,
Okay
medyo
lang.
blown away si Chris by
Yan.
the history of
Kasi
Ukraine.
nakalimutan
Pero now,
namin
Yes,
mag-mute.
I
pero
think
now he's
so.
back.
Sobrang,
Welcome back, Chris.
grabe.
So
Grabe
yung
What do you
epekto.
think?
yung gusto ko lang i-point out is kung gaano ka-important yung Ukraine sa Russia, since later I'm gonna discuss kung ano yung parang economical intentions ng Russia towards Ukraine, kung tsaka maybe naging intention rin siya ni Putin in invading Ukraine. Parang yun lang.
I agree. And soon, and moving forward in the discussion, we will see sneak peeks of what Ken said, yung geographical and economical implications. But before that, let's move on to a brief history of Russia naman before the war. Jesus, you will take the floor.
Yan. Akin na to. Akin na to. Ako na to. Ayan. So, grabe naman tayo. So, syempre, kwento mo yan. Syempre, masama ako. So, syempre, two sides tayo. Russia naman tayo. Going Russia. Hindi lang si Ukraine. So, si Russia, siguro, very elementary trivia. Siya yung pinakamalaking country sa buong mundo, syempre. Tapos, nakita naman natin yung mapa ni Ukraine kanina, medyo maliit lang. So, parang si Russia yung big bully. Ayan, tapos si Ukraine yung, ayan, cute lang, cute lang. So, syempre, doon pala, makikita natin, ang daming macroeconomic fundamentals na meron ang Russia. So, ito, nakikita nyo, galing ito sa European Union mismo, yung kanilang journal, ang European Parliament. So, dito makikita ang factors ng kanilang GDP, kung saan ito nagtatalaga ng healthiness ng kanilang ekonomiya. So, makikita nyo rin dito ang unemployment rate. At syempre, dyan nyo makikita ang female labor force participation rate. And mamaya pag-usapan natin yung importation at exportation na nangyayari sa Russia. So first, doon muna tayo sa GDP. So compared sa EU27 or yung average ng other nations, bukod sa Russia na nakapaloob sa European Union, so medyo mas mataas talaga yung GDP nila per capita every year. So, pero somehow naman, stabilize yung ekonomiya before ng war sa Russia, stabilize naman. Nakikita rin natin dito yung annual GDP growth. So, ayan, tingnan natin. So, way before, siguro mga 10 years ago, medyo mas mataas compared sa EU27 ang kanilang annual GDP. And then, nung medyo lumayo-layo, siguro around 2018, 2019, medyo nagka-same na sila ng EU27 and feeling ko dun sa medyo dulo-dulo, medyo epekto siguro to ng pandemic kaya medyo bumaba yung annual GDP ng Russia. So feeling ko lahat naman ng mga countries because of the pandemic bumaba yung annual GDP growth. So dito rin nakikita natin yung total unemployment rate. So sa total unemployment rate, so makikita natin sobrang taas ng sa EU27. Kung makikita niyo sa bandang 2015, ayan. So sobrang peak yung unemployment rate ng EU27 compared sa Russia. So medyo mababa yung sa Russia compared sa EU27. So, hindi na tayo masyadong magpo-point out sa mga percentages, pero titignan pa lang yung chart, sobrang ang laki nung gap na meron sa pagitan ng EU-27 and ng Russia. So, siguro medyo pressured yung Russia na itaas pa yung pagkakaroon nila ng anong tawag dito, ng labor forces, ayun. So, dito makikita yung exportation din and importation. So, dito nakikita natin yung iba't ibang ine-export at ini-import sa Russia. So, sa tingin ba natin maapektuhan ng malaki yung pag-export at pag-import ng other countries from and to Russia? So, siguro pwede dahil sa war nga. So, medyo yung mga investors, lalo na yung mga malalaking countries, yung mga sa third world, so medyo magiging anxious sila kung ituloy pa ba ang pag-invest. And kasi once na makisawsaw lang sila dun sa issue nga ng Ukraine-Russia, 'di ba? Bukod sa US kasi narinig natin kanina yung US talaga is nagpadala ng mga nuclear forces para matulungan yung Ukraine. Yung siguro yung mga other countries na medyo reserved para sa kanilang mga citizens, ganyan. Siguro hindi nila trip, ganyan, hindi nila bet na sumali pa sa pagdating sa pag-i-invest sa Russia kung nakapalob na to sa isang war. So, what do you think, guys? Ano kaya yung mga possible na mangyari sa Russia? Kasi before the war to eh. Ngayong, sabi natin, aftermath na ng war. Actually, hindi pa siya tapos, I think. So, ano tingin yung mga possible na mangyari sa Russia? Thinking na sobrang laki ng ekonomiya niya. Ang laki-laki. Like, di ba? Ano kaya yung mga possible na mangyari? Kasi, feeling ko si Russia, after nito, since siya naman yung nang-bully, di ba? Siya yung nag-umpisa. Siguro kaya niyang mag-keep up sa mga damages, casualties, no? Yung Ukraine talaga is medyo hindi. Kasi except sa maliit sila, hindi rin ganun kalaki ang kanilang military forces. Diba? So, what do you think, guys?
Jesus, I just want to say na I agree yung analysis mo on where Russia's GDP falls off because of the pandemic. Because as we can see here, diba, Russia exports a lot of gas. As you can see, transportation is its largest export. And because of the pandemic, no one can go out. They do not use cars, and that's why the GDP went down. But as we can still see in the present, Russia is very important to other countries, right? So I'm also intrigued with what you said. What will happen to Russia after the war? With its importance as an export and of services in goods.
Agree. No? Sobrang. Ayan si Chris. Go, Chris.
Naka-unmute ba ngayon?
Naka-unmute na to.
Naka-unmute,
Naka-unmute na, sir.
So doon naman sa tanong mo na kung maapektuhan ba yung imports or exports ng Russia kahit siya naman yung parang invading nation, ano. So siguro masasabi ko it's yes, because since yung ibang countries is kahit hindi sila, let's say, physically kasali, wala silang pinapadalang troops, pwede pa rin nilang parang in a way i-sanction pa rin yung Russia through economically. So dito later di-discuss ko kung paano ito ginagawa. So doon in that way parang naapektuhan yung imports at exports ng Russia.
Ayan si Ken. Go, Ken.
Hi, wait lang. Before I share, is my audio clear? Audible ba ako? Medyo choppy kasi dito.
Yes, it's perfect.
Okay naman, okay naman.
To piggyback on what Chris said, I guess aside from parang considering the implications or the repercussions of parang the economy of Russia after the war, we should also consider yung parang diplomatic relations. Kasi di ba, they instigated the war against Ukraine and ganon. And given that they rely more on their exporting industry, paano naman if yung ine-exportan nila is actually like against yung maybe philosophy nila or kaya yung ginagawa nila right now? I think it's something to ponder.
I agree. Napaisip din ako dun bigla. Pero feeling ko mas mapapaisip pa tayo bigla kung malalaman natin yung changes na nangyari sa Ukraine at Russia, no, dahil sa war. And dahil dyan, yan, pag-uusapan natin ang changes na nangyari sa Ukraine at Russia. Take it away, Chris. Ayan, go, Chris.
So to discuss yung effects on the economic geography, of Ukraine, both Ukraine and Russia, meron akong 3 points na i-discuss. So yung unang-una is Ukrainian economy has continued to shift westward, which is away from Russia. No? So economic shifting westward means that economic activities are denser in the western part of Ukraine, meaning yung economy nila is nag-tilt towards the Western European countries. So dahil ito kasi sa yung Ukraine traded more with other European countries since before it used to sell most of its complex manufactured goods to Russia, such as cars and aircraft. Ngayon, it exports more agricultural goods and electronics to Germany and other European nations. So, it could be apparent naman or parang could be anticipated na mangyayari ito since merong growing aggression sa East since nga doon yung nangyayaring labanan. So, syempre, yung tendency ng firms is to establish or invest in businesses away from the ongoing battles. So, another factor rin is evacuation. So, civilians and refugees are getting farther away from the war. So, this means yung population density ng Ukraine would be skewed. So, as a result, there are more people at much safer places, syempre. So, which is likely sa west, na mas malayo doon sa ongoing battle sa east. So, yung yung basic economic functions mo, yung transportation, yung mga telecommunications mo, yung banking, or yung other economic activities, or yung pang-araw-araw na mga gawain ng mga tao tulad ng pamimili, are syempre mas marami din kung saan mas malaki yung population mo. So yung phenomenon ito yung parang pag-stay away ng people tsaka yung mga firms sa area kung saan merong ongoing conflict could be similar sa diniscuss ng earlier parts ng class natin yung intervening opportunity, although medyo kakaiba siya kasi imbes na pipiliin yung mga tao is yung mas malapit, gusto nilang mas lumayo kasi syempre it's a war. So parang kabaliktaran siya ng intervening opportunity sa concept ng intervening opportunity. So yung shift na to is nagsimula nung start of war, di ba? Pero really, as discussed nga kanina ni Carlito, it has been happening na before pa nung yung 2022 invasion. So parang mapapaisip ka na lang din na yung intention ba talaga ni Vladimir Putin could be partly economic, which is partly economic talaga. Kasi for a very long time, Ukraine has been mainly buying goods and resources with Russia. But after Ukraine has started trading more frequently with other European nations, parang mas tumaas yung tension between the two nations, which kinda exhibits also yung dependency theory, yung how the resources flow from Ukraine, let's say, a less developed country compared to Russia. So yung medyo mahaba-haba to, no? So yung next point is yung economy ng Ukraine is talagang naapektuhan. So obviously kasi it's a war, So unang factor nito is destruction of infrastructure. So destruction of infrastructure that supports basic economic functions such as roads, yung syempre makaka-affect yon sa logistics kung masira mo yung mga roads mo. Destruction of goods tsaka yung buildings, makakahinder yon sa basic services na provide. So talagang maapektuhan. So similar rin sa factor na ito is yung disruption sa economic activities from primary to quaternary activities. So primary activities mainly yung agriculture, since yung Ukraine is one of the main exporter ng wheat and corn in the global agricultural market. So when the war started, syempre people were forced to abandon one of the key factors of economic development which is arable and cultivable lands. So lastly, war is expensive talaga. War is expensive. So some of the national funds ng Ukraine is reallocated for defense. And when it comes to the point na hindi na kaya i-support or i-fund ng Ukraine ang sarili nito, syempre manghihiram ng funds. So its debt will be very huge after the conclusion of the war. So ito yung parang ina-anticipate ng mga economists. So most of these factors are due to the loss of key resources for economic development. Adding on all to these factors pa is the war started when nations were trying to recover from the pandemic. So since the pandemic has also caused similar problems with the war, yung disruption of economic activities and deaths, which decreased populations, which could be somehow be linked to the decrease in the labor force then. So yung last and final point is sa changes naman sa nangyari na sa Russia. Since tinanong kanina ni Jesus, kahit siya naman yung invading country, meron pa rin effects sa GDP o sa imports and exports nito. So United States and other nations around the world has condemned Russia's invasion of Ukraine. So yung ginawa nila is nagpataw sila ng economic sanction by trying to isolate Russia from the international community and inflicting economic costs. So some of these sanctions are cutting of Russian banks, or kinokontrol din nila yung exports na ipinapadala sa Russia, then binablock din nila yung imports na galing sa Russia. So yung ganon din yung ginawa ng United Kingdom. So yung parang observation ko lang dito is, so yung only this yung let's say na yung mga rich countries are imposing sanctions or imposing embargo towards Russia. Maybe it could be because only these rich countries has the capability of doing so, kasi compared to yung developing countries or yung mga third world countries, kung sila yung gumawa nito, talagang parang yung i-expect natin is parang mas malaki yung drawback nila as compared to kung yung mga rich countries or yung developed countries yung gumawa nito, yung mga economic sanctions. So yun yung 3 main points ko, to describe how the economics of both Ukraine and Russia changed when the war started.
Chris, gusto ko lang matanong sana, since you pointed out that only parang yung rich countries or yung developed countries are imposing the sanctions or yung parang penalties on Russia, and you said na it's about the capacity of these countries, how would that affect kaya yung developing or kaya yung countries that are not as rich, given na may sanctions nga sa mga exports ng products ng Russia?
Siguro dito pumapasok yung globalization tsaka yung interdependency of yung nations, since syempre no one nation have the all types of resources. So in a way we somehow share resources, maybe yun na lang yata. Parang syempre wala namang isang bansa na nasa kanya nang yung lahat. Syempre geographically yung other resources are found in other nations, so we're kind of forced to trade. So kung ganon, if let's say yung rich countries is nag-impose ng economic sanctions towards Russia, syempre yung global economy, tulad yan ang nangyari, yung for example is yung oil and gas prices tumaas. Syempre mas maapektuhan yung less developed countries kasi yun nga.
I agree.
On
agree,
that
Chris.
note, di ba I think... okay, sige, go, Carl.
I just
Baka
wanna add
gusto
yung
mo
sinabi
i-expound
ni
ba?
I just wanna add to yung sinabi ni Chris na we learned in economic geography that most cases it's the richer countries or the more developed countries that are pouring resources into the lesser developed countries for them to go up. So if the higher developed countries place sanctions and they restrict trades, mas kawawa talaga yung mga developing countries.
Yeah.
Yeah,
On that
agreed.
note, naaapektuhan kaya yung Pilipinas? What do you think, guys, sa war ng Ukraine? Since parang ang layo naman natin, pero in a way, naaapektuhan ba tayo?
Feeling ko, mapapasadahan natin yan later Medyo spoiler. Pero feeling ko medyo may disappointment tayo sa pagdating sa Philippine context kasi medyo minamaliit yung mga possible na effects ng Ukraine-Russia war. Tignan natin mamaya. So, bago tayo dumako sa application na ng geographical concept. So, gusto ko lang din ulit i-insert lang since sa shinare ni Chris, yung evacuation ngayong keyword na evacuation. So, hindi kung titingnan, hindi lang sa Ukraine yung possible na evacuation, no? Pwede rin sa Russia. Kasi kung ikaw ay Russian citizen, siguro ayaw mo rin, siguro ma-anticipate mo na possible na madamay ang mga inosenteng Russian citizens sa war. Na possible na pwedeng, since nakakuha na ng help yung Ukraine, ng mga nuclear force galing sa mga US, other Western countries, possible na bumalik yung counter-offense ng Ukraine, na ginawa ng Russia sa Ukraine. So, possible na madamay yung Russian citizens and alam naman natin na nadamay na yung Ukrainian citizens. Hindi rin basta-basta yung pagbalik nila or baka yung mga nag-evacuate ngayon hindi na bumalik sa Ukraine. So, ang laking bawas nun sa human resources na meron ang Ukraine at malaki rin yung possible na mabawas sa human resources ng Russia. So, hindi tayo sure kung ang bet pa bang bumalik ng mga nag-evacuate ng mga citizens sa Ukraine at Russia, no? Kasi kung iisipin, malaki rin yung apekto nun not only sa society but sa culture na nabuo kasi hindi na talaga ganun. Like, alam niyo naman yung mga meme na kapag nabasag mo raw ang plato, kahit ibalik mo pa raw, kahit i-tape mo, hindi na siya tulad ng dati. So, ganun din naman yung Ukraine at Russia, no? So, hindi ganun kabilis bumangon ang Ukraine and hindi rin ganun kabilis mag-move on ng mga Ukrainian citizens. So, pwedeng nag-migrate na nga sila totally sa ibang lugar, ganyan. And doon sila titira for good. And yung Ukraine, forever na may kulang sa human resources eventually. So, magandang pag-isipan yun. And feeling ko mas dadami pa yung iisipin natin dahil mapupunta tayo sa geographical concept. Ayan, go. Take it away.
Okay.
Before I start with the next slide, Jesus, your question really parang sparked yung parang a thought to me. And I would like to bounce it back sa'yo. If ever, guys, it was in the Philippine context and we were invaded, ganon, and we were asked to evacuate. And may opportunity naman na babalik tayo. Would you do it? Or ganon? Start kay Jesus. What do you think?
Hot seat po, grabe.
Grabe naman yan.
Pero kung ako, actually parang hindi na no? Kung nakaalis ka na sa Pinas, ba't ka pa babalik? Charot. 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 Pero ang pinakatanong talaga, kung makakaalis ba ng Pinas agad-agad? Kasi parang, feeling ko dito na ako tetenga. Dito na ako forever, no? So, feeling ko mahirap kung sakaling magkaroon ng war kasi anytime soon na possible. Marami tayong issues ng mga territorial disputes and everything, no? Marami tayong mga bilateral agreement, no? Marami May mga arbitration pa tayo. So, anytime soon na possible yung war and kung mangyari man, kung ako, I hope na, ayun nga, makalayo and baka hindi na talaga bumalik. And kawawa naman ng Pinas kung ganun din. Kailangan din talaga ng Pinas ng human resources kahit ayaw na natin. What do you think?
I agree. How about you? Ikaw, Carl. Si Carl muna, ask muna natin yung iba.
Okay, I agree kay Jesus kasi I actually read sa economics of Ukraine even way before this war started. Noong 2018, nagde-decline na yung population nila. So people are sensing like danger and war, obviously from the civil war, and they are not coming back. So based on economic forecasts, I think if people were to go out of the Philippines, they would also not come back, sadly.
Kung ikaw ba, babalik ka ba? Sa
Me?
Pilipinas na may kapal, gano'n.
Depende, but I trust economics. So if economics says it's unlikely, then I'm unlikely to come back. Okay. How about you, Chris?
Okay. Ikaw,
Will you come
Chris.
back?
So, bye.
Ako,
Go, Chris.
if nakaalis na, no? If nakaalis na, no? Siguro titimbangin ko muna kung, syempre, if comfortable na ba yung pamumuhay ko outside of the Philippines. So what if mas naghihirap ako doon, then I have no other choice talaga, which is to bumalik kasi, syempre, comfort zone na din. So yun. Parang titimbangin ko muna yung choices ko if babalik ba or hindi.
Okay, good answer. Good answer. So before we continue, ikaw, Ken, ano yung sagot mo? Hindi ka pa nagsasagot, ah.
Ah, siguro kung ako, I'm a bit of an idealist kasi. And like yung
Hindi na yan
sinabi
babalik.
ni Jesus na, ay, babalik kaya ako. Kasi di ba sabi na parang walang mangyayari. Or maapektuhan talaga yung country natin if wala yung human resources. That is tayo. So parang to make Philippines a better place, babalik talaga agad. And in connection sa mga answers natin, ganun, we can see that population really has parang an effect on economy and parang vice versa siya. So next slide, Carl. Carl, please. Next slide.
Next slide now. Do you guys see it? Application.
Unfortunately, di ko pa nakita. Ito na, okay na.
Okay.
To the viewers,
Sure
minor
na po yan.
technical
Sure na
lang.
yan.
So, okay, sure. For this part ng roundtable discussion namin, we will be integrating yung thoughts namin earlier into parang much more comprehensive or to see kung ano talaga yung perspective nito in a geographical sense. For this part, we will be discussing about yung economy and population geography, yung effects nito sa politics, yung global implications, and including na rin yung economic policies, yung trading blocks and ganon, and even sustainable development. And for the last, and as what Jesus mentioned earlier, we are still, kahit na malayo tayo in a physical sense, we are still affected sa mga events na nangyayari sa Russian and Ukraine war. Presenter, next slide. I'll go on na lang. So for our first parang concept, we will be tackling kung paano siya nakaka-apekto sa parang population geography. And I think as what Chris mentioned earlier, parang there is a skewed population density. Yung nangyayari na nare-redistribute yung population because obviously, or to be practical, if you will obviously move sa place na mas magiging safer ka. And in that way, there is yung migration ng people. It will encompass yung distribution of the population. And with that includes yung movement or abandonment ng mga infrastructure, yung mga important resources, as Chris mentioned, yung banking, transportation, and that has significant repercussions sa parang economic development and even the country. So for example, during the first few months of the war, I believe, parang there was a significant issue sa transportation na yung people can't travel kasi puno yung trains, puno yung I think traffic yung roads. Narinig niyo ba yun? Or kaya na tingin niyo na nakikita niyo sa news? Yung news
Yes,
na gano'n.
my congestions.
Mm-mm. And with that said, parang we can say that population really has an effect and ganon. And actually, we can study this through looking at the natural and migration population change, which we can attribute nga sa nangyayari na war. And this good population density also has implications on economy, which will likely affect or will transpire pa in a future sense, given that the population has moved, migrated, and the infrastructures have also changed, then for the long term, maapektuhan talaga yung economy nila. And I think Chris even mentioned earlier yung primary and quaternary activities, lalo na yung sa agriculture. Chris, can you parang clarify or kaya expound those further? Yung nangyayari
Since yung
about the agriculture.
since yung Ukraine nga no is very, I think yung nabasa ko ata na data is 9% ng wheat tsaka 12% ng corn. Sila yung nagpo-provide nun sa global market ng agriculture. Kaya nung nag-start talaga yung war, affected talaga yung food supplies.
Mm-mm. And now, naapektuhan nga yung food supply. So, paano nga yung population? So, that's parang the main thesis of the population geography. Do you have any insights to add ba, guys, about that? Or wala na? I think we can proceed na since medyo heavy or compacted yung topics natin. The next slide, presenter.
Okay, next slide na
I
to.
can proceed. Okay po. So for the political and economic geography, we can infer na parang the legislation or yung politics, especially yung policies, as I have mentioned earlier, can really affect yung parang relationship between economic and geographical. Given na yung definition ng political geography ay parang yung mutually constitutive relationship or kaya nang nakaka-apekto yung isa sa isa at nakaka-apekto din yung isa, yung government, citizens, and countries. And like I pointed out earlier with Carlito's statement that location affected its future. The Warsaw Pact versus the NATO, yung EU versus the, ano nga yun, Eurasian, ano yung sanabi mo kanina, Carlito?
Eurasian Economic Union of Russia.
Yes, that one. So yung parang implication or yung underscored na parang political diplomatic relationships nila is affected by the geographical location, which if you could remember, audience, it's that the Ukraine is parang nasa sa center ng Russia and the EU and the other countries. So in a way, parang siyang nagiging buffer zone from further attack in the future, and it's literally in the middle of the Eurasian continent. So in that way, parang nagiging motivation siya ng Russia to actually instigate the war kasi they were threatened, if I remembered it correctly, tama ba? That was the main motivation.
Yes, they were threatened because
Kasi
NATO and Europe wanted to expand towards the east.
And if you could remember, Chris also pointed this out that there is parang a shift westward, shifting westward yung Ukraine towards Western countries and ganon. And that was the main motivation behind the Ukraine-Russian war. Does any of you have anything to add with ano yung parang relationships ng political and that economic geography and the war?
Yes, unfortunately, if it was just purely economical, then there would be compromises or agreements between Europe and Russia. However, unfortunately, politics have to step in, and I think Russia's president, Vladimir Putin, has very strong politics and in terms of expanding territory and political geographical influence, especially in the Eurasian continent. That's why Ukraine is so important, not just as an economic ally, but as a political ally as well. And unfortunately, that caused the war.
And yes, and in addition to yung ano politics and ganon, yung politicians talaga, there is also yung policies na it can motivate and it can resolve or mediate war. Kasi sabi ng article na nabasa ko, war actually, since you will be in the Russian and Ukraine context, if Russia invades Ukraine, then they will have the access to distant markets and scarce resources, given that it is found that Ukraine has an abundant number of resources. And as mentioned kanina, na Ukraine has arable land kasi nga agriculture yung primary na parang industry nila, which was unfortunately abandoned kasi nga because of the ongoing war. On the other hand, it can resolve war, yung economic policies, if yung may economic interdependence that is in a way na parang nag-help together na yung mga countries. And I think it was Chris who mentioned na there is no single country that has all of the resources. Tama ba, Chris? So in a way, we are helping each other. Pero unfortunately, parang in another lens, we are affected by kahit minor lang, na nangyayari sa ibang country. Tama ba, Chris?
Yes. Since wala naman talagang nation na meron all resources, and we're just sharing talaga yung resources.
Tama. So parang yung question na naman ngayon is, what if those resources or kaya yung parang process behind trading those resources or parang just isolated or di naman isolated pero parang concentrated siya to a number of particular countries lang or a number of particular territories. Like what would happen to those na hindi part of that group or yung part naman of that group? This is what is called trading block. May idea ba kayo, initial idea kung ano yung trading blocks and ganun? Even if it's not in the geographical sense, pero yung initial thoughts niyo lang about blocks.
Ako, I assume yung trading block is restricted tradings between countries. So they leave other countries out. For example, Russia's oil. From what I've read, they've only been exporting to China and other allies, but they're not exporting to US and allies of the US. So my trading block between them. That's my understanding.
How about Jesus? I haven't heard you in a while. Are you
Oh,
still there?
yeah,
Hi,
napapaisip
man.
ako eh. Napapaisip talaga. Pero tingin ko, yung trading blocks is yung parang maybe grupo siya ng mga countries, tapos sila yung nag-i-importan at exportan sa isa't isa and meron silang agreement when it comes to things, ganyan. Kung ano yung mga, kunwari si country A, ganitong type ng goods ang kanyang i-import, tapos ang kailangan naman niyang i-export ay yung ganito kasi ito yung kailangan ng kanyang country, ganun. So, feeling ko ganun nag-work ang trading block. So, parang may sistema sila sa loob ng isang grupo ng country, ganun.
Yes. Ikaw, Chris, ano naman yung interpretation mo ng blocks?
So medyo may nabasa rin ako, no? Yung pagkakaintindi ko is parang nag-uusap-usap yung mga countries based sa available resources na nila at yung makukuha nilang resources from other countries. So based doon parang nag-group up sila. So based on what they need para mas ma-maximize yung resources din.
Tama nga. So, nag-group nga tong mga countries na to. And parang mapapaisip ka rin, so what happens to yung non-members? As, yung sinabi ni Carlito kanina na yung Russia nag-export ng sa kanilang mga allies and not anymore to those na parang that oppose them. Before I proceed, is my audio still clear? Parang naglalag ako on my end.
Yes, very perfect and clear.
Clear pa, clear.
Before
okay pa.
Okay pa.
Sige, go.
Before we proceed, magbe-break muna tayo to restart the meet because Zoom has a limit of 1 hour and 10 minutes na lang natira and marami pa tayo. So, restroom break muna sa mga audience, okay?
We love you everyone. Babalik kami.
We'll be back.
Commercial break. Bye, guys. See you
Commercial
in a
break.
Come back
while.
kami
Hello.
for sure.